Hello everyone, and welcome to an episode of Ghost Stories with Isabella. We're going to be covering all things paranormal, so if you love ghost stories, stick with us because we've got some of the best. So I put out my first call today to get responses from viewers. If you have a ghost story but you would like to submit, you can email it to missisabella@gmail.com, and I will put the email below in the comments so that you can find it. Submit us any story as long as it is a real paranormal encounter that you or someone close to you that you know has had. So let's start with the ghost stories. Today we've got a couple. Our first one is from Larissa from England. She says, "I'll tell you the scariest ghost story I have. The scariest for me, that is. I was alone with my 8-month-old nephew. It happened at my sister's house. It was around 11 a.m. I took my nephews upstairs for me to have a bath with him. We were playing for about half an hour before we went down so that I could feed him his lunch. I always keep my trainers in a cubbyhole by the stairs, the toes of the shoe against the door, in the same position as I always take them off. As I walked past with the baby, I noticed that they were about 3 inches away from the door. I shrugged it off, thinking I must have been imagining things, but I had this strange feeling that I was not alone. I should probably mention now that it wasn't a secret that this house was occupied not just by my family. Anyway, this was the first time I had properly stayed there. I was taken in by my sister after the death of my fiancé. After hearing the food was ready, I went to take it through the living room. I glanced at my trainers again and was shocked but not surprised to see they had been swapped around. The right shoe was on the left side and vice versa. I was I just thought to myself not to worry and just to carry on feeding the baby. It was time to get a little yogurt for my nephews. I walked past the shoes once again. They were now facing me. They had done a complete 360-degree turn and were in the fashion of steps, one slightly in front of the other. And they were now facing me, and about 2 feet away from the cubbyhole, over the threshold of the living room. By this point I was crying and shaking. I took the baby outside. I rang my brother, who came with his girlfriend to see what was going on. He wanted to see what I was making such a fuss about. He searched the house and found nothing. And once I calmed down a little, I asked him to bring my trainers outside and away from the house. Like that would help. I told him to do one last sweep before I went back in. He was out about 5 minutes later looking befuddled. He told us he went into the front room, and right next to the cubbyhole, he found several coasters strewn on the floor, where no more than 10 minutes ago there was nothing there. We were a little shaken and confused by this. It was obviously a playful spirit, but when you are alone, nothing is making any logical sense. Playful becomes bloody terrifying. I've never had anything so profound happen to me in that house again. Apart from being locked in the bathroom for 8 hours. That sounds terrifying, even though the door had no lock and wouldn't shut properly anyway. These stories happened 7 years ago, and I remember every single detail. I moved out a fortnight later into my own flat. I haven't stayed in that house since. Thanks for letting me share my story with you. Thanks for sharing your story with us, Larissa. If you have any ghost stories, feel free to submit them. You can email them to missisabella@gmail.com. That was a great story. Let's look at our next one. Okay, this next story I'm going to be telling you from memory. This comes from a friend of mine. Well, a friend. I know him on Tumblr. He'd submitted me this story on Tumblr. He lives in the UK, specifically in the Isle of Wight, which is a little island on the bottom of the coast of England. He lives in a place called Shanklin, which is a little town there, and his story comes from that area. So he told me that he was walking back from school one evening. He usually would take the bus, but that evening he had missed a bus, so he decided to walk home. There was a little lane between where he lived and his school. It was dark. I want to say he said it was around 7 o'clock and it was winter, so the sun had already set in the UK at that time. So it was dark as he was walking back. He said that he saw the figure of someone walking on the opposite side of the road, and every time he'd ever walked that route, it had always been empty. and he saw this figure getting closer and closer to him, and he had a really ominous feeling about it. At first he wasn't aware it was a ghost or an apparition, but he said even just looking at it made him feel uneasy, like that this person had bad intentions. And so he switched to the other side of the road so that he wouldn't have to physically cross this guy. Anyway, as he got closer, he noticed this guy was dressed in period clothing, so he wasn't wearing normal clothes. He said he had a cloak on his back, like a coachman's cloak, which is kind of a cloak with two sort of layer sort of thing and a hood on the back, a long black cloak, and riding boots as well. When he saw this, he really got scared. He didn't want to deal with this, and so he said his best thought he could do was to avoid this person from actually crossing his path, was to jump into the hedges. I swear to God, he said the hedges were on his left, and it was all wood. Keep in mind, down this road, it's wood either side. And so he climbed into the hedges, into the shrubbery, and he hid. And literally, as this thing, which did turn out to be a ghost, got closer to him, it stopped by where he was hiding, and it just stood there. And he told me, he said he felt his heart racing so fast, he thought it was going to jump out of his chest. You know, his heart was just like dum 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 dum. And he stayed very quiet, and he was like, please don't let this person come over here. Please don't let this person come here. And the guy after he stopped walking, he turned around and carried on walking. And then literally the guy said he was peering out the bush, watching this guy still, but the man just disappeared in the middle of the road. And at that point he was so scared he ran all the way home. But what's interesting about this story is the lane that this man was on is actually rumoured to be one of the original stories for the Headless Horseman. So you know, in America you have Sleepy Hollow, we have a similar fable in the Isle of Wight of a headless horseman. And this guy had his head, but he was wearing a coachman's cloak. So I always thought that was very interesting and a very creepy tale. Okay, this next ghost story is actually one of my favourites. I first heard this ghost story while I was living in the UK. It was actually in a magazine. It had been submitted by some teenagers, and I remember reading it at the time and being like, wow, that is one of the creepiest and best stories that I've heard, and so I'm going to retell it to you today. So, the girl who wrote in, she worked at Butlins holiday camp in the UK, and Butlins, there's a couple of them. This one was in the north of England. They're sort of like holiday retreats, kind of like how in America you would have camps that you could go to and sort of do different activities. A Butlins resort is very similar. They'll have a pool and a sort of motel-like place that you can stay in, and they have movies and a canteen with food and all sorts of fun family-packed activities, right? So they're all working at the Butlins, and they're called the Butlin Redcoats, and you'll know them because they all have to wear red. That's how you can recognise one of them. So anyway, they were staying there. They were 18 at the time, and you know, a lot of their duties was to look after people there, and they went through a series of training. So once the Butlin resort was empty at the end of the season, they got to stay on for a couple of days to help clean up and just to sort of talk through their training and whatnot that they'd gone through. Anyway, so one night they decided that they were going to go and watch a movie. So a group of them actually snuck into one of the cinemas in order to put on a movie and watch it. And they did this successfully. The group of them got into the cinema. They were all sitting there. They hadn't even put the movie on. And they saw from the back of the theatre this figure, and it came floating down the aisle. But what was really, really terrifying about this figure was that it was only from the waist up. It had no legs, okay? It was a torso, a floating torso. And they said it actually looked like a soldier because it had a cap on, a military cap, and a jacket. But you could not see the legs. It was like it was disemboweled, was the words that they used. And I remember just thinking that was terrifying. So this thing was coming down the aisle, and half of them, you know how cinemas are, they're set up so it's like two different aisles. Half of them were on one side of the aisle, half of them on the other. You know, they decided they had to scarper British slang. It's like they had to run. They had to get out of there. And so they all got up. Half of them got up and ran out and successfully left. But then the other two kids apparently were stuck in there with this ghost. And so the story is from a perspective of the girl who left. And she said they got out there. And eventually the others were able to join them. And they said that this ghost was completely oblivious, didn't even notice them. And it just kept floating. And it went down the aisle, across, and then up the other aisle, and then vanished into midair. And after that they were able to run out. But what I thought was really interesting about this story was afterwards, once they were done, they did some research on the location of the Butlins holiday camp, and it actually used to be the location of a military training base in the UK during World War I and World War II. So I think that's very interesting because they did see this man dressed in his cap, and he obviously must have been a soldier or some sort of military figure. So yes, I thought that was a great story, and I hope you've enjoyed it. Next up we have a story from Edward in VA. I assume that's somewhere like Vermont. I don't know my American states very well. Someone can correct me on where VA is if I'm wrong. He says, "Mistress." It's an interesting way to start a ghost story. "Mistress, I just noticed your tweet about ghost stories, and I thought I'd share at least one with you. It was sometime in 1985, after the sunset in a remote countryside where I lived at the time. It was a calm evening and very little wind was blowing. I happened to look out the door at the eastern woods and noticed something small but glowing in the gathering darkness of the distant forest. I grabbed a pair of binoculars to get a closer look at it, but I still could not understand exactly what the small but bright glow in the dark was. I left the house and decided to drive down the road and try and pinpoint the exact location and identify what the glow was in the thick forest, and it appeared to be coming from somewhere behind an old, abandoned house. As I looked, it appeared more like a flickering glow of a small campfire down in the woods, somewhere behind the old house, but I could not be sure. I turned around and went back to my house, but could still see the glow in the same location. Slowly, it began to move through the dark forest, as if someone was running with an old flickering lantern, but moving almost too fast for a human, I thought. That's strange. I could hear no sound either. That was also strange. When the glow approached the public road, the mysterious light vanished as quickly as it had come, at a point which was directly in line with a very old graveyard, which was hidden some yards on the other side of the road in a dark wooded area. A graveyard which had long ago been abandoned and forgotten, with old rocks and grave markers without any inscription, and a mysterious dead tree that overlooked the graves. I never did find out what the mysterious glow in the dark was that night, but I think it may have something to do with the mysterious old graveyard in the path of the woods before it vanished. Have a happy Halloween this year. Thank you for your story, Edward. I hope you guys have enjoyed this episode of Isabella's Ghost Stories. I'm going to be cutting it short with this episode just because of the lack of decent audio that we have and the noise from cameras focusing. Once I do get my lav mic and I can improve this setup a bit, I will be planning on doing 15-minute episodes with a lot more stories in them. So please stay tuned. Take care, guys.